All right. Well, thank you very much, Susan. I think Tony Jones is he'd better be careful. Where the AMA is running up an alternative host to a Q&A. So congratulations on the session, Susan. Thank you very much to those speakers. It was a very interesting session. Now, can the delegates take their place and recover from the concept of revalidation, to take a deep breath, because we're now about to have a session which is traditionally a highlight of AMA National Conference. And this is the AMSA President's address, and this year it is given by the AMSA President, Elise Buisson, President and Executive Director of the Australian Medical Students Association, the peak body of Australia's 17,000 medical students. Elise also holds a non-executive director role at UWS Connect Limited, a not-for-profit company formed by the Western Sydney University. Elise has been employed by the AMA New South Wales as a policy writer in a casual capacity since 2014. She's currently a medical student at Western Sydney University and is also studying for a psychology degree at UQ. And she is slated to graduate in 2018. Welcome, Elise.
Good morning. My name's Elise. I'm a medical student from Campbelltown in Western Sydney, and as you've heard, I have the great privilege of leading and representing the 17,000 medical students around the country. I'm honoured to have the opportunity to speak to you today, in particular because even as a student, the AMA has been a source of support for me. As you've heard mentioned, I work for a state AMA. I have a seat on Federal Council, and as of yesterday, I have not one, not two, but 3 AMA federal election caps. I'm a proud owner. I want to see the AMA go from strength to strength, and the health of our nation with it. Now, my goals in early life started off a little differently. When I was 14 years old, I was pretty confident I was going to be a hairdresser. I'm not a fan of small talk, so I'm comfortable predicting it would have been a disaster. But I met the wife of one of my school teachers who was a hairdresser, and she seemed pretty happy, and it seemed to me that probably becoming a hairdresser was a good way to become happy. There's an enviable simplicity to the thought processes of 14-year-old me. I had a really fantastic teacher when I was in middle school. His name was Mr. Niker. Now, when I told Mr. Niker I was going to finish up year 10 and leave school, he sat me down and said to me, "I don't have a lot of power around here, but I'll do what I can. So you tell me the top 5 reasons you want to leave and I'll try and help you." Mr. Niker was right. Early career middle school teachers do have a lot less power than many others in this world. They even have a lot less power than many others in their school. However, what Mr. Niker understood, and what I've come to learn, is the responsibility of those with even a little power to affect change for those with less. There weren't 5 things that Mr. Niker could help me with. I'm not really sure there was even one. But seeing that he was willing to fight to keep me around made me believe it was a fight worth joining. As a result, I've come to learn both how much my life is owed to those who've helped me in even the smallest of ways, and also how much I can influence the outcomes of those around me in return. When I reflect on the 10 years since, I draw great humour and great humility from the slightly paraphrased words of my very favourite comedian Tim Minchin. "You're lucky to be here. You're incalculably lucky to be born, and incredibly lucky to be brought up in a nice life that helped you get educated and encouraged you to go to uni. Or, if you were born into a horrible life, that's unlucky and you have my sympathy, but you were still lucky. Lucky that you happened to be made of the sort of DNA that made the sort of brain which, when placed in a horrible childhood environment, would make decisions that meant you ended up eventually graduating uni. Here's the part for the days you need to be reminded to be humble. Well done you for dragging yourself up by the shoelaces, but you were lucky. You didn't create the bit of you that dragged you up. They're not even your shoelaces." Thank you. This is not to say that personal responsibility and personal choice do not matter or are not significant. I didn't always expect much from my life, and when I came to realise that I could change the story that seemed laid out for me, I did my best to make a better life instead. But my best is different to your best and the best of the person sitting next to you. We all have different strengths, and we need different kinds of support, and our outcomes are dependent on whether or not those needs are met. My life, as I see it, is the sum of individuals who took an interest in me long before I looked like one to back. I owe many of my opportunities and successes to people who have urged me forward when I needed it the most. I think most of the people in this room would acknowledge the same. This is to say that those who feel they're a self-made man or woman are misinformed. We have all received help, even as small as a kind word, and those individual actions, individual decisions, individual people can and have changed our lives. Because of that help, we are a room full of very privileged people. Now, privilege is not to say we didn't work hard or even that we didn't deserve it, but that we are winning a race in which at some point we were given a running start. Even those from the worst possible backgrounds upon gaining entry to medicine inherit a security and position in society that most will never have access to. That gives the medical profession a lot of power. I believe as a result we have far more responsibility than most for what we choose to do with it. Having all received help to gain our positions in society, we ought to use our positions consistently and wisely to in turn help those with less. We should do it because we can, and we should do it because it's right. I think those in this room feel the same way. It's why you became doctors, and it's why you're here today. Now, in 7 months, I'll finish my term and a new president will take my place. My name will live on in impeccable gold lettering outside the AMA boardroom, but many of my ideas won't. So it's fair to say I feel a responsibility to use my platform frankly and effectively in the time that I have left. At some point, it became clear to me that the best thing I could do for medical students was not to be afraid in discussing matters from mental health to sexuality to gender equity, in the hope that they would feel they could speak about the things that have the potential to hold them back. A little earlier this year, I wrote an article in the Sydney Morning Herald that discussed my mental health when I was very young and the contributing factors. I was in grade 5, the first time I can remember being suicidal. I'm lucky to have built a wonderful and happy life for many years since, but the memory of that desperation has never left me. I see it in people around me, and they are facing their battle in perhaps a more unforgiving environment. Children are resilient and doctors are too, but the stakes are higher when you have a social standing to lose. When I was in my first year of medical school, we were given a lecture on doctors' mental health. Our lecturer was well liked and well respected because it was universally known that she genuinely cared about all of us. She got up in that lecture and she told us personal stories of the deaths of those around her as a result of the pressure of medical school and medical practice. Her final slide was a picture of a diamond and huge lettering, "You are precious." We all felt pretty loved and pretty looked after that day, but we were too early in our training to recognise how hard things were about to get for some of those sitting beside us. A number of people I was close to suffered severe mental illness during that very first year of medical school. The one that worried me the most, after the storm was weathered and appropriate help being sought, told me that in the darkest moments, "You are precious" was the reason to go on. The well-known Beyond Blue study of 2013 found that 40% of doctors believe that those with a history of mental ill health were perceived as less competent by their peers. I've personally spoken to many medical students who are suffering, many who have contemplated suicide, rather than risk being found out as having asked for help. People are considering death as a reasonable alternative to what they perceive as our judgment. Don't underestimate how closely your juniors are watching your offhand comments on mental health. Don't underestimate the repercussions of all of our actions, destructive or protective. This is within our power to change. I hold my executive meetings in a state AMA conference room where I'm greeted by a long line of dashing grayscale photos of state leaders. My team sometimes likes to play a game of Spot the Woman. It's a problem we have in AMSA too. Social entrepreneur and absolute legend Holly Ransom this week highlighted in a speech to medical students a Harvard study with a comment on the issue. It found that, given 5 essential criteria for a job application, women would sensibly enough apply when they filled about 4. Men would apply when they filled 1. What the women had in capability, they lacked a bravado, and they fell out of the running because of it. When only 1 in 5 AMSA presidents are women, I'm not all that surprised that women are not progressing up the chain. This is their first major opportunity to learn to lead in this setting, and being underrepresented means they're already behind at the starting line. I've been told by a number of people this year that the reason women aren't in leadership in various areas of medicine is a lack of interest or a lack of ability. I think we should take more responsibility for the situation than that. We are failing to create leadership environments that foster their interests, and we are failing to provide opportunities that foster their ability. This is a problem I now have responsibility for in AMSA, so I'm accountable for both my individual actions to encourage future female leaders and my actions in improving the system. Let me implore you as individuals. Encourage women to take a step forward and you'll find they're just as capable of and interested in standing on their own 2 feet. Do it early, do it consistently, do it as an individual and make it part of a strategy. This is within our power to change. An empowering example of the AMA's advocacy, both through the dedicated task force and through this conference itself, has been the focus on recognising vital research in Indigenous health and supporting the representation of Indigenous health professionals. Unfortunately, despite all of this, the dropout rate for Indigenous medical students remains 30%, while non-Indigenous students like myself make it through 99% of the time. This year I've learnt a lot from the people down the road at the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, or AIDA, but if I distilled it down to just one lesson, it would probably be how much more remains that the individual can do. This room is full of people who've successfully navigated medical practice and who have an interest in strengthening the future of the medical profession. These students are that future. As individuals, we can take a role in engaging with the most committed and knowledgeable stakeholder, AIDA, to get these students through, in order to create the Indigenous health leaders that this nation needs to close the gap. Working together, this is within the power of the medical community and the Indigenous community to change. So I've spoken about what we need to do for our own, but wider society also looks to the people in this room for leadership on many things. Rita Fercho had this to say about the role of doctors in society. Medicine, as a social science, as the science of human beings, has the obligation to point out problems and attempt their theoretical solution. The physicians are the natural attorneys of the poor, and social problems fall to a large extent within their jurisdiction. We are a broad church. We share a common purpose. Most of those in this room have sworn or will swear an oath to first and above all do no harm. But harm is not only the result of action, but of inaction as well. On issues such as the indefinite detention of asylum seekers and refugees, climate change and even marriage equality, the AMA has the ability to contribute to change. We hold power and ought to wield that power on behalf of those who have less, be they within the medical profession or in wider societies, to do harm. The primary example I can share with you of seeing my peers really engage with the AMA is when they heard about the speech Professor Auler gave at the AMA's Refugee Health Forum. It tapped into a belief in them that we have a responsibility to do more. Ending offshore detention engages medical students more than any issue I can name. I cannot get medical students to march in the streets for their own job prospects, but to protest the health impacts of our nation's treatments of refugees, they will make their own placards. Those in offshore detention are vulnerable people like any others that we as individuals came into medicine to serve. As such, it makes perfect sense that these are the people that the AMA, as a collection of us, exists for as well. In 2016, we are staring down the barrel of a vote or a plebiscite for marriage equality. A plebiscite will be $160 million worth of ugly, and it will cause the health of the LGBT community harm, but it will likely happen nonetheless. The Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists recently announced their support for marriage equality, premised on the evidence that shows, and I quote, "The discrimination and marginalisation experienced by the LGBT population increases the risk of developing mental health issues and creates barriers to accessing supportive services. Governance, and particularly health governance of society, exists to maximise the potential of each and every citizen, free from physical and mental burden. All communities have the right to the best attainable health, and all doctors have a responsibility to ensure that those who are marginalised and stigmatised against are provided equitable opportunity for and access to good health in order to serve not only themselves but their families and communities in turn." It's not news to anyone in this room that one of the AMA's two core objectives is to participate in the resolution of major social and community health issues. This major social and community health issue requires resolution. History will at some point look back and ask where we stood. As doctors, we should be utterly confident we can justify the health basis for what they will find. The health impacts of climate change are perhaps the greatest public health threat to face my generation. In a political climate that has recently seen our Deputy Prime Minister wonder aloud if perhaps climate change is real after all, the voice of respected and highly educated citizens like yourselves has been of the greatest benefit. No non-political actor wields the public influence of the people sitting in this room. Those continued advocacy efforts put pressure on the government to respond to climate change as a health threat. That advocacy should be praised and should be protected. We all stood together yesterday and swore our commitment to the Declaration of Geneva, as so many of us have before. I solemnly pledge to consecrate my life to the service of humanity. Fighting for these issues is in the service of humanity. But if you don't buy that as a point, let me offer you this one. It's also in the service of those in this room. Your potential future members are people like me. And I say potential because despite my best efforts, at times I see the disengagement of my generation of doctors. Many of you can speak from far more experience than me. But my own experience has been that people become loyal to member-based organisations based on what they can give rather than what they can get, and what they want to give is a voice to issues that drive them. As interns and doctors in training, they'll come looking for a place to translate the passions they acted on in AMSA. Passions ranging from rural health to gender equity to climate change. If they don't find it, I suspect they will search for another place to contribute their voice instead. In addition, fighting on these issues is in the interest of our standing in society. To speak on behalf of social issues does not lessen our influence in other matters. It amplifies our voice as the community leaders that the public want us to be. When we are seen to stand in a well-reasoned and non-partisan manner for issues of broad social importance, it confirms in people's mind that we do not exist for self-interest. That makes us a more credible voice. As a medical student once passionately declared to AMSA Council, it behooves us to be more than unionists. That the AMA exists as an advocacy body already does an immeasurably great service, both to the medical profession and the wider public. The AMA doesn't just do things nominally, it is outstandingly effective. That success and community standing in turn leaves us well placed to do more. Health isn't determined only in waiting rooms and clinics. Health is determined socially, and that's the attraction of the AMA for people like me. The ability to tackle these big social issues that make people sick and give them an opportunity for a better life before they ever meet me as a medical practitioner. To do so is well within our power and our responsibility. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elise. I say every year that the address by the AMSA President is a highlight of National Conference, and again, it has been this year. Thank you for a frank and brave address. The AMSA Presidents really instill great confidence in the rest of us that the profession is in good hands in the future. Elise, you have our thanks for that address and our respect. We'll now break for morning tea. I'll see you again in half an hour.